Yesterday, the Canadian Conference of Bishops released two statements in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Can you tell me about them?
The statements are both responses to calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first statement is a response to call to action number 48, which asked faith communities to endorse and to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The second statement is a response to call to action number 49, which asks faith communities to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the Doctrine of Discovery and a concept called terra nullius, suggesting the land belonged to no one before it was occupied by Europeans.
What has been the process for the Catholic Church responding to the TRC calls to action?
When the calls to action were first made public at the TRC's final event in June of last year, the Justice and Peace Commission of the Bishops' Conference was asked to study the calls to action, in particular those addressed to the churches and the churches involved in residential schools. In September at our Bishops' Plenary Assembly, we led a discussion, and bishops were very engaged in that discussion about the calls to action. And then the Justice and Peace Commission was asked to do some drafting, and we have produced a draft of these two texts that were published yesterday, then engaged in an extensive process of consultation with Indigenous people and with the Canadian Catholic Aboriginal Council. After a lengthy process, the Bishops' Conference brought together representatives of the Canadian Catholic Aboriginal Council, the Canadian Religious Conference, representing the various religious communities in the country, many of whom were involved in residential schools, and Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace. Chaired by the President of the Bishops' Conference, Bishop Doug Crosby, with representatives from the Justice and Peace Commission, we discussed this document, these documents. We went over them carefully, made changes, and now the documents have been signed by all of these groups, which is really a new development for the Bishops' Conference, a text not only put out by the conference or a particular commission, but by really a group that represents the Catholic Church in Canada.
Would you say that the Church has taken the TRC request seriously?
Yes, I would. I think that the whole Truth and Reconciliation process has invited a deep awakening among the Catholic community, as it has for the whole people of Canada. And I think Catholics have learned our culpability in a very flawed Indian residential school system, much more than we had before. We've also been moved by the way in which the TRC Commission and its final report don't write the churches off. Instead, they call us to integrity. They call us to own the sins and mistakes of our past and to conversion. I mean, they call us to action, to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, to address wrongs. During the TRC process and at all of the major national events, bishops were present and offered apologies. And those apologies were received, but we also know that apologies aren't enough. So I think there is a real readiness to engage not only with the calls to action, but with a new way of walking in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. How we do that is something that we're learning together, right? These are first steps of a long process.
Has it been a learning experience for you?
Well, indeed it has. I mean, I think the whole Truth and Reconciliation process has been a learning experience for most Canadians, any Canadians who've entered deeply into the process. The accounts of how Indigenous children were taken from their homes, often taken far from their homes, sometimes forcibly. The terrible accounts of sexual abuse, but the more frequent accounts of physical abuse and of a kind of a spiritual or cultural abuse, being cut off from their culture, and the way in which the whole residential school system was geared towards assimilation. I hadn't understood that well beforehand. It's also been a deep learning experience to read the TRC's final report. And I really encourage people to engage profoundly with that text. What a powerful text the TRC final report is. I think one of the other things that I've learned and many others have learned, or we're learning rather, is the relationship between the Truth and Reconciliation, it's the relationship between the Indian residential schools and the challenges that Indigenous people face today. We read about the statistics of incarceration rates among Indigenous youth, Indigenous men and women, many of the challenges in terms of poverty, in terms of lack of access to good education, a lesser quality education available to Indigenous people. There are a whole string of social problems and challenges faced by Indigenous people that are deeply connected to the Indian Act and to the Indian residential school system. And we're seeing those connections much more clearly than we did before.
What are some of the areas where the Catholic Church is most challenged by the TRC process?
Well, I think, like all Canadians, the biggest challenge is how to be changed by this process. There's a transformation invited of us. So how do we learn to walk the talk? The calls to action in some instances are very specific. And how do we find a new way of walking with Indigenous people? How do we take this, which we have learned, because the residential school, the TRC process has really taken us to school, right? So how do we learn to reach out to Indigenous people more and build stronger relationships? We're at the beginning of a big learning curve. Secondly, I think we need to learn to tell our history in a different way and in a much more truthful way. Last summer I had an experience which really brought this home to me. I was touring with a cultural anthropologist, and I asked him, where is the oldest trace of human settlement in what is now Saskatchewan? And he indicated a site between the towns of Aneroid and Pontex. And it was disarming because that site is less than a half an hour from the farm where I grew up. And yet I knew nothing of it. And my telling of the history of that region really began with the arrival of my great-grandparents and my grandparents and their settling of the land. That's such a limited and restrictive, narrowing version of our history. So we need to tell our history in a new way, but that history needs to include and treat well the suffering of Indigenous people, the story of the Indian Act, the story of residential schools, the way in which the coming of European settlers, of immigrants, created profound challenges for Indigenous people and their way of life. Another challenge that the Catholic Church faces is how to hold together a deep understanding that the residential school system was flawed, that there were tragic things that happened there, and that the larger legacy of the schools is really a difficult legacy, with the reality that there were lay people, women and men, religious and priests who did serve there generously and offer themselves, and their sacrifices were genuine, and their care for the students was genuine. How do we hold those two together? The TRC final report also speaks of that and grapples with it and talks about how difficult reconciliation is when we listen faithfully to both those strands. We don't want to throw under the bus all of the people who served in those schools, but at the same time, we don't want to adopt a defensive posture, and we want to hear deeply the pain and suffering of Indigenous people in order to respond. So that's a big challenge. The other area I would say that we face here in Saskatoon, and I'm sure in many other places as a challenge, is how to walk with our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are Catholic and who want to hold on to something of their spiritual traditions, at the same time live their lives as Catholics deeply. So how do we listen and learn to them, to engage in a dialogue, and to think through where it's appropriate in our worship to include, for instance, a smudge, or praying in the four directions, where to include elements of Indigenous spirituality that are completely consistent with our Catholic faith and Catholic worship. There's a lot of discussion to be had there.
Let's go back to the two documents now and look first at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Well, the Catholic Church has been a strong supporter of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, and many of the rights identified in that very fine document find an echo in Catholic social teaching. There's a very close relationship. When we read that document, we read about the rights that every human being and every cultural or linguistic group, every community should have. The right to education, the right to their own cultural practices, spiritual traditions, the right to language, rights in relation to land and territory, to economic development. So our statement really echoes our profound support and endorsement of the UN Declaration. And it talks about the ways in which the Catholic Church, sometimes with other Christian churches, sometimes on its own, has indicated its support of the UN Declaration and has encouraged the Government of Canada to endorse and implement the UN Declaration.
The text has an apologetic tone.
The Truth and Reconciliation's call to action about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples comes very much out of the context of residential schools, where the rights of Indigenous peoples were denied in systematic and multiple ways. And so we're mindful of the ways in which, 60% of the residential schools were operated by Catholics, by religious communities, by dioceses. And so we're complicit in that system. And part of the experience that students experienced, children experienced in the residential schools was that their culture and their spiritual practices and their beliefs were seen as illegitimate, were belittled. There were terrible accounts that we heard about Indigenous kids being called heathens. And so the Catholic Church has a long tradition of advocating for religious freedom and liberty, but we haven't always been faithful to that tradition, and we haven't always lived it out very well. And so we're trying to name that in this document, to be honest about it, and to commit ourselves to do better and to work together with Indigenous people to uphold religious freedom.
The TRC also asks what faith communities are going to do about the implementation of the UN Declaration. What does the present document say in that regard?
It's much easier to endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples than it is to implement it, just like it's much easier to endorse in principle Catholic social teaching than it is to live it out. Right? So if the UN Declaration was taken seriously, we as a society would need to change our economic priorities. We need to change the way we live in relation to the environment. We'd be called to a real wholesale transformation. And the Church has experienced that call to be a part of that transformation. In our document, we tried to list a number of areas where we could work and where we would encourage involvement in terms of healthcare, significantly in terms of education, to do treaty education so that all Canadians know about the treaties which were signed and which we're called to live up to, right? The work of restorative justice, addressing the huge inequality. It's really it's got to be seen as a systemic racism, which leads to a situation where a much higher percentage of Indigenous people end up incarcerated, end up facing all kinds of social challenges. So we can do some things at the level of the Canadian Bishops' Conference. We can continue to engage in dialogue, engage in religious dialogue with Indigenous spiritual traditions, engage in dialogue about how we can walk together in terms of economic and political change. But much of what needs to happen at a local level. And the UN Declaration calls for the rights of Indigenous peoples to be upheld in many different ways, and that involves a changing of the way we live locally. here in Saskatoon, we're taking a few small steps, but they're small steps, right? We held a conference. It was called 10,000 Healing Steps, and I think that's really what's needed here in terms of implementation of the UN Declaration. So we have a local diocesan council for truth and reconciliation, where we meet with Indigenous leaders, and we try to discern what issues we want to address and how we can address them and how we can do so together. We've been supporting a Cree language program in one of our churches. We're working with our Indigenous community in terms of finding a new home, in terms of spiritual practices and traditions. We've got a number of small initiatives. We worked with other Christian churches on an event about missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. What we need is many more such small steps which bridge our communities and show a real walking in solidarity. It's a start, right?
Let's move to the second document concerning the Doctrine of Discovery in Terra Nullius.
Very good. Well, in that second document, what we tried to do was to take the lead from the TRC Call to Action number 49, which invites faith communities to repudiate any concept used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as Doctrine of Discovery or Terra Nullius. So our focus was on the first part, right? We treat Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius, but what are the many different concepts which were used to justify European seizure of Indigenous lands? So we identify 5 points. We make 5 affirmations, which are in some sense repudiations. Anything which suggested that Indigenous people didn't have the full rights and dignity of every human being, anything which suggested they weren't created in the image and likeness of God, any argument which said that there was a church or a religious or a theological foundation for the seizure of Indigenous lands, we want nothing to do with. There were arguments that were put forward in the midst of colonization, suggesting that if you didn't have certain European agricultural practices, certain cultural traditions, really the land was considered unoccupied. So we want to repudiate all of that. That's the first thrust of our document and our attempt to respond really directly to the TRC's request.
There's some controversy about the Doctrine of Discovery. In what way is this text a repudiation of that doctrine?
Well, the Doctrine of Discovery is not a Christian doctrine, and I think that's often been misunderstood. It's a legal construct from early 19th century United States. Likewise, the concept terra nullius, literally no person's land, is a 19th century concept. So the first thing I'd want to say is that when colonizing powers came to North America, they didn't say, we're implementing the Doctrine of Discovery here, we're implementing terra nullius. They gave all kinds of justifications, or they simply seized the land. And later, the government of Canada enters into treaties, right? But there's a seizure of lands which comes early with colonization. And so the Doctrine of Discovery is one of the concepts which was used historically, not at the beginning, to justify the seizure of Indigenous lands. And we want to repudiate it, but our repudiation has to go larger than that. And we also want to say, and we say clearly in the document, there's no church teaching or justification for those concepts of seizure of land.
What is the relationship between the Doctrine of Discovery and the Papal Bulls?
Right. There were a series of Papal Bulls issued in the 15th century, which are sometimes seen in relation to the Doctrine of Discovery. There isn't a specific connection, but these Papal Bulls were very much a part of the culture of the time, and in settling international disputes, for instance, between the two maritime powers of Spain and Portugal, both Catholic nations, There were times when the Pope was appealed to or where the Pope intervened. And so there are papal bulls which justify Portugal takeover of land in Africa, including the seizure of taking captive of peoples who were seen as non-Christian. And there was a bull after Columbus's voyage which gave to Spain all land west of a certain imaginary line in the sea. Of course, these papal bulls, from our perspective, are deeply problematic. I mean, they don't identify the rights of indigenous peoples. They seem to give one nation land that was already occupied by other nations. First of all, these bulls were seen as problematic soon after they were issued. And so other statements were issued saying things strongly to the contrary, saying that the rights of indigenous peoples needed to be respected, that there was to be no religious coercion, that their lands were not to be taken over. So there is a kind of a de facto repudiation through statements to the contrary that were issued soon thereafter. Now, historically, the Catholic Church not only moved on then, but has specifically indicated that any political component of those papal bulls is not part of the deposit of faith, has no value or credibility, should not be appealed to today. There was a statement along those lines made recently at the United Nations by the Holy See's UN observer. In our document, a very lengthy appendix, which is really there for scholars and people who are deeply engaged in this question, goes into some detail about all those papal bulls, about the authority they had, and the authority of other bulls which superseded them, and the statements, historical statements about Catholic commitment to religious freedom, liberty, rights of indigenous peoples. It's a complex conversation.
Are there other responses to the TRC still to come?
I think that the Bishops' Conference and we as a Justice and Peace Commission certainly look at this as a long process. I think we see the TRC calls to action as an invitation to engagement. So we're not checking things off a list, right? We're looking for ways to be engaged. But there are some specific calls to action that invite response. Several have to do with education. Education around treaties, education for our clergy and in our seminaries, about the relationship between the Catholic Church and Indigenous peoples, which would include the residential schools, the way in which the churches were complicit in a project of assimilation, which we wish we would have distanced ourselves from, right? So there's broader areas of education work that needs to be done. There's also an invitation to truly respect Indigenous spiritual practices. And here I think we look at this in two ways. We have a dialogue to engage in, which has been underway for a while with Indigenous Catholics, to find ways in which Indigenous people can bring their tradition, their spirituality into their Catholic faith. Pope John Paul had a magnificent quote when he was in Australia. He said, you can't take off your Indigenous identity the way you take off a pair of shoes, right? You need to bring your whole self, your people, your history into your Catholic faith. So we need that discussion. How can we allow that to happen more effectively than we have to this point? And then we have a conversation with Indigenous people who are not Catholic, perhaps not Christian, but who still want to engage in a discussion or a dialogue about Indigenous spirituality. And that's a conversation we look forward to. There's an invitation to the churches to contribute to community building and healing projects towards reconciliation. So in sum, I think there's a lot of work to do, and we're at the beginning of this process.
What about the TRC's request for Pope Francis to come to Canada to meet with Indigenous peoples and extend an apology for the Church's involvement in the residential schools?
Well, that's a call to action which got quite a bit of attention, needless to say, also attention from the media. I have to say personally that I had a number of conversations with Indigenous people about that, and one conversation in particular was very helpful. An Indigenous friend said, you have to understand, we're not asking the Pope to take, it's not that we think the Pope is personally responsible for everything that went wrong in residential schools. We understand from our sense of family that when one person in a family does something wrong, the whole family is needs to be engaged in the process of restitution. And we understand Pope Francis to be the father of your family. And so he needs to be involved in the restitution relating to the Church's involvement in residential schools, and he can do that by coming to Canada, meeting Indigenous peoples, and then extending an apology. I find that argument very powerful. Anyway, the TRC request, the Holy Father has been duly informed about the TRC's request, and it was presented to him in a very sympathetic way. And I'm sure that he's going to take it very seriously. That being said, I'm sure that Pope Francis has received dozens, if not hundreds, of invitations, and every one of them has its own integrity. So we wait and see.
Are you hopeful?
Well, I think it would be a beautiful thing if Pope Francis came to Canada and met with Indigenous people. I think that there's some healing that could come about from that just can't come any other way, right? I think it would engage Indigenous people in a way that our statements of apology haven't. There was a very important meeting which took place in 2009. Then Chief Phil Fontaine, Archbishop Jim Weisgerber, and a delegation met with Pope Benedict. But that meeting, in that meeting, the Pope Benedict expressed regret for the sexual abuse that took place in the residential schools, and it was very meaningful. But the TRC report talks about that and says, very meaningful for those who were there, but many Indigenous people didn't know about it, haven't heard about it, and weren't touched by it. And it didn't deal with the whole legacy of residential schools. It dealt with the terrible acts of sexual abuse. So I think there's an invitation here which really would go much, for something which would go much deeper. Pope Francis has apologized to Indigenous peoples in the Americas, in Bolivia. He offered something of an apology again on a recent visit to Mexico. I think his heart is always open to and attentive to people in need, and he's looking to redress the Church's, the wrongs that Catholics have been engaged in the past. And so I think his heart will be with this, but I can't imagine what his schedule is like, but I'm hopeful.
Any final pieces of information you'd like to pass on to viewers?
I guess I'd really like to encourage Catholics in this country to engage with the TRC's document. We don't have it as a specific list item on the list of recommendations or possible actions, but I know it's been deeply moving for me to take time to read not only the calls to action, but to read large segments of the TRC's final report. It's an incredibly written document. This is a landmark moment in Canadian history. We're dealing with something, and it's not only the residential schools, although that's enough for us to deal with, but it's the Indian Act. It's a whole historical relationship between the settlers, the immigrants who came to Canada, and the Indigenous people who lived here. And we're called to deal with that history now in a way that we haven't done to this point. And I think the TRC's final report is such an exceptional document there are moments of frustration when you read it, and moments of pain, moment of suffering. But I think taking the time, read volume 6 if you don't have time to read the entire final report. It's an invitation to change. It's an invitation to a deeper engagement, and I believe the Holy Spirit is in this process, in this invitation to us as church. So that would be my final word of encouragement.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop Don, for taking some time to talk about this very important subject.
Great pleasure.